actually putting something down, taking a moment, like literally 5 seconds, where you go over and you look at them and you say, there you are, my beloved. I remember you. Do you remember me? Here we are in this crazy life together. Or taking the dog for a walk and holding hands. Like just these little moments. You give a hug and take a deep breath. These little micro moments keep the climate of the relationship warm. And that helps the entire ecosystem of the family. And it makes all of the communication so much easier, so much more open.
Welcome to the Family Dialogues podcast. I am Dr. Taniesha Burke. After children, many couples feel like they've lost each other, not because they stopped loving, but because they stopped being seen, touched, and truly connected. The truth is, that dip in desire, that distance, and that feeling that we're just roommates with children, it's not a red flag. It's a normal, predictable phase of parenting. And today we're talking about how to come back to each other, not with grand gestures, but with small daily choices that rebuild friendship, safety, and desire over time. To guide us in this conversation, we're delighted to be speaking with Dr. Rebecca Howard Eudy. Rebecca is a certified sex therapist and author of Parents in Love, A Guide to Great Sex After Kids. Certified in emotionally focused therapy, she helps couples navigate sex, desire, and connection in the whirlwind of parenting, even when life and kids make it feel impossible. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I think many of my listeners might be thinking, sex therapies. I think it's so important because, lots of times when we talk about parenting, it's how to get children to behave, how to run the home. And the most important part of the family is the healthy relationship with parents, because if a couple is not happy, then the whole ecosystem in which the children live will not be happy. And, you run the chance of disintegration and possibly separation in the process. So I wanted to talk to you about how young couples even with teenagers or empty nesters, can really maintain that romance with each other despite all the parenting challenges. So to begin that, I would love to know your journey behind becoming a sex therapist and why you decided to focus on parents in particular.
Yeah, sure. So this work that I do and this book that I've recently written really comes out of a combination of my own personal experience. As a parent myself, I'm a married mom of 2 boys. My kids are 9 and 11. So they're a little bit older now. Things are starting to feel like we have a little bit more space. I mean, their schedules are busy, but it's not that same, like really, really hands-on intensive parenting that it was in the beginning. And so I am in my own life and my own relationship starting to see like we're sort of in this nice moment where everybody's sleeping mostly, we're getting to the place where we can kind of leave the kids for an hour or two and like go for a walk or, go on a date without having to get a sitter. So it's feeling a little bit easier now. But in the beginning, my kids are really close together. They're only 19 months apart, and it was full on. It was so busy. And, it did really feel like a lot of the times we were really ships passing in the night. It took a lot of intentionality and a lot of effort to be able to reconnect. And even with that, the reconnection was never as much or as long as we wanted. It was like little drips and drabs of it. And so that really informed my own work. Before having kids, I worked with kids. And then once I had kids, I didn't want to do that anymore. But I still wanted to work with families. And I still wanted to, impact kids' lives. And so that's how I sort of ended up starting to work with couples. And then once I started to work with couples, what I started to hear is the same things. The same things that were happening in my own life were happening in my clients' lives. That this really difficulty reconnecting, this feeling of being more roommates than lovers or partners, the deep commitment to each other didn't always translate into, romance or erotic charge. And in fact, actually, sometimes it really shut that down. And so hearing that again and again, what I ended up deciding to do is really to educate myself. And so I went deeply into the research. I got, the sex therapy certification. So my interest in this field was really sort of led by both my clinical work and my own personal experience. It's hard.
Yeah, it's super hard.
It's hard.
I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and it is hard. We have to be so intentional with connecting with each other and maintaining that romantic side because you don't even notice sometimes it's happening how quickly you get into the routine of making sure everybody is fed, taking care of your little ones. And then at the end of the day, you're just so depleted that you really don't want to, touch each other or anything like that. And if you allow that to go on for some time, it can get to a point where you just feel completely disconnected. And I think some parents listening might be at that point. And we're here to provide some tips for how they can move beyond that. And if they can't do it on their own, possibly reaching out to you as well to see how they can reignite the romance in their lives. Is that the same dog that you mentioned in your book?
No, this is a different dog, actually. So the dog who joins me now his name's Acorn, and we got him when it was right at the beginning of COVID in 2020.
Okay.
So the dog that I mentioned in my book was the pre-kid dog, and this dog is like the opposite. This is what he does all day. He like sleeps.
He's chilled.
He's so chill. He's so chill. That dog who we loved dearly was really high maintenance. And so when we decided to get a new dog, we really wanted a sleepy one, and that's what we got.
Yeah. Similar to children, different personalities.
Yes.
In the beginning chapter of your book, I read something that you described with one of your clients. And I think as I'm going to read it to parents, many of them will relate to it. You say from the excerpt, "And now we can't find our way back," says Sam. "It's not just physical exhaustion. It's the mental load, appointments, school activities, ensuring everyone is fed and clothed and where they need to be on time. It's relentless. I can't even think about spending time on our relationship, much less having sex. It feels like another thing on my to-do list. One that gets pushed pretty far down," she sighs. "I feel like I just need time for me. By the time the kids are in bed, all I want to do is collapse." And I just like, yes, I remember that. That so many parents were like, "I know it's important, but all I want to do is just collapse. I don't want to do anything else." Why is sex so important for the maintenance of a romantic relationship with our partner?
Well, I think that sex is important in a relationship if one or both people feel like it is. So there are some couples, some relationships where sex is not a big part of how they connect, and that's okay. But if one or both of those people, if the people in the relationship feel like sex is something that they want in their lives, and, this is probably the majority of people feel that way. But certainly there's some folks who, are sort of more on the asexual side, or, they have other arrangements where maybe they're in a relationship that's like more of a non-monogamous commitment or something like that. And they sort it out in different ways. There's nothing wrong with that. So anything that people are doing that's working for them, great. There's nothing wrong with if you're in a relationship where it's working for you, that's great. But a lot of times what ends up happening is that people have a different level of desire. So one person feels like they'd like to be having more sex or a different kind of sex than the other person. And then that can create this tension between two people where you have a higher and a lower desire partner. And that can over time lead to feeling really disconnected. One person feeling really lonely, or even both people feeling really lonely, really not connected with each other. And then that leads to resentment and, all kinds of other feelings that can, really erode the warmth and the connection in the relationship over time. And so for couples who have a monogamous commitment with each other, which is the majority of married couples, sex is something that they've agreed only to do with each other. And, sex is not a basic human right. It's not a need. Nobody is entitled to anybody else's body, even though in the monogamous setup, sometimes that can start to feel like they are. Like there is like this feeling of this is not what I signed up for. And that's understandable. But that does end up shutting down the connection and desire over time. And so it's really important to look at how can couples work this out? How can they each be able to ask for what they need and be able to meet each other in finding, a level of sexual connection that works for both of them?
Yeah. One of the things I would love for you to explain to couples, because I think there might be a difference with couples who don't have children, when there are issues regarding level of desire. But so many people with children, before the children, came about, they had almost the same level of desire or the same level, and things were great. And then children show up, and then there is this shock. And all of a sudden, one partner, usually the mother, is no longer interested in sex. Can you explain, especially I think for fathers, what is happening there and the transition? It's not that your wife doesn't love you anymore or anything, because a lot of men just feel rejected and dejected and demotivated, and they keep going back on, oh my God, our sex life was so amazing. And now these little people are here and I can't even touch my wife. Explain to them what's happening in that transition to cause that, black and white kind of thing happening in the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. So many things happen. And I do think, statistically speaking, there have been long-term studies that do show that men tend to have a higher level of desire overall. And this is mostly because of testosterone. So testosterone is something that governs what we call spontaneous desire. So spontaneous desire is like you're walking down the street and all of a sudden you're just ready to go. It's like, think of it like a light switch or a lightning bolt. But there's another kind of desire that's really important to understand, which is responsive desire. And responsive desire, importantly, starts with willingness. It doesn't actually start with desire. So when you start from a place of willingness, what you might be starting with is wanting to connect, wanting to feel connected to your partner afterwards, knowing that once you get going, you're going to get into it. It's going to feel great. And then afterwards, it's going to be warm and, the sort of afterglow there, but desire, when you have somebody who has more responsive desire, which typically is more women because they have less testosterone, they starting with willingness means that they may not actually feel desire until after they have physical arousal on board. So that means that they show up feeling like, okay, let's get going, but they need a little bit of coaxing. There needs to be a little bit of seduction. And so when we think about, as so many couples do, how it used to be, the good old days before kids, or maybe even in a couple that doesn't have kids, before they were really committed, before work got crazy, before everything, really started snowballing in this way. The thing is that a lot of times when we look at what we were actually doing then, couples had a lot more time to connect with each other. They were planning dates. They were going on vacation, just the two of them. They were sitting around and just talking about whatever. So, and with the planning of the dates, when we think about this higher level of desire, we like to think in our memories that there was so much spontaneousness, this spontaneous desire, just having sex everywhere. It's like the kitchen counter, wherever. But the reality is that is often a myth, because what we were doing is we were talking, we were texting, we were flirting, we were planning dates, we were, getting all cute and figuring out outfits and blow drying our hair and, doing all of the things that get us into the mood so that when we are in a situation where we can be, quote, spontaneous, we're ready to go. But really what that means is that runway was already built in. And so when we replace all of that flirting and planning and longing and connecting with the really routine, mundane routine of what kids need, which is predictability, which is not spontaneity, which is, predictable bedtimes. And we as parents need to be able to have the resources to show up when our kids are melting down, to dig deep and kind of like give them what they need, even when we ourselves may be running on empty. So it makes sense that runway that might have been there before, where the sort of flirting and the erotic charge that is so important for somebody who has more responsive desire, when that's not there, then the desire is sort of gone as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And for couples listening, that responsive desire, uh, especially with young children, does it naturally come back over time, or is it that they have to intentionally recreate that intention, to have that responsive desire?
So it depends. For some people, it does come back. And, importantly, even though the research does show that men do tend to be a higher desire, in general, they have higher desire, the difference is not that much. So I guarantee that we have, parents listening where it is switched, where if they're in a heterosexual couple, the female partner is the higher desire partner. And that can also be really challenging, because if you're sort of out of line with what our like gender and cultural norms are, then that can create sort of an additional level of pain, like what's wrong with me, or what's wrong with you that you don't want me. So that's sort of additionally painful. But yeah, so it can come back. So some people, when they're pregnant, when they're breast or chest feeding, when their kids are not sleeping, their desire really takes a nosedive. That's totally normal. And it can be really normal for it to come back. It also is normal if you're a female partner and you are, or you're a male partner and you're the lower desire partner in your relationship, and after kids you're really struggling to kind of re-find that spark. That's also super normal as well. So for some people it does come back, and they're able to reconnect once they start sleeping again, once the hormones around, the perinatal period sort of calm down, they can find it. I would say that more often I see people really have to actively cultivate it. Desire begets desire. So the more we're able to kind of stoke this fire, the more we might be interested in getting into this space with each other, and not just sex, but the flirting, the connecting, everything that goes with a partnered sexual experience. And so if we think of this as like more like a campfire, like if we think of it as like a light switch, you either have desire or you don't, that doesn't set us up for success, because then we just sit around and wait for it to come back. I just don't have any desire. I don't really know what to do. So that's the thing, is if we expect that the responsive desire is going to need some tending, you when you make a campfire, you kind of have to keep it going. You can't neglect it entirely and expect it to just survive. So, and that's going to be personal, like really personal for each couple, what it is that kind of stokes their fire. So getting really curious about what it is that helps your partner to get into a place where they're more willing, where they have more access to that desire.
Yeah, and the responsive desire, and that, as you mentioned, the access to it. I'm thinking maybe as you're speaking, I was thinking maybe it's starting from scratch again with date night ideas, and maybe when they're on dates, they're not having conversation about the children, but talking about things that they used to do together, or even not just dates. But when you have children, one of the things that can happen is that you're so busy, you don't even touch each other. There's no hugging, there's no goodbye or welcome home kiss, because you're just so busy with the routine of making sure the household is run properly. So perhaps I'm thinking it's to get back to that basic of really connecting without everything being relating to the kids. And I know sometimes mothers in particular might feel a bit guilty that they're not really talking about the children. But I think it's important, right? So when they're dating, going for dating, not necessarily going away for 2 hours or something, but maybe like a 15-minute walk around the block holding hands, that they're not talking about, oh, I need to replace diapers. I need to, take the child to the doctor for a wellness check and that kind of thing, right?
Yes, absolutely. You nailed it. That's so true. It can be really hard to shut off that like mom brain. And caretaking is not sexy for very good reason. It shouldn't be sexy. It's completely a different system. And so a lot of times what I hear people say is that they have to sort of transition. It's a little bit harder to transition back into this, adult relationship when you spend so much time thinking about, and the kids really can be all consuming because they need a lot. But yeah, absolutely. I think that the examples that you gave of those, for a lot of couples, they fall into this trap of not touching each other at all and then sort of expecting to jump right into having sex. And that is not real. That is not conducive for somebody who has more responsive desire. But a lot of times what ends up happening is, particularly when the lower desire partner is the mom, and particularly if mom is the default parent, even if mom is working full time, they're sort of that default person. The kids, especially young kids, need so much of that physical attention. And parenting is a deeply intimate exercise. What could be more intimate than having and loving and raising these little humans? And they do need a lot of intensive physical parenting. We're hugging them, we're kissing them, we're looking at them, we're pouring love into them. And so it does often end up being that we're sort of we've poured so much in. We get to this place where I hear a lot of parents talk about being touched out. Like they're like, I'm done. I'm touched out. I'm shut down now, at the end of the day. But the piece that parents don't necessarily always talk about, or maybe even think about for themselves, is that they may also be really deeply satisfied, overwhelmed. Yes. Exhausted. Yes. But satisfied. They have gotten their intimacy needs. That check mark is met, and it's non-sexual, of course, but it still is. So then the parent who's the non-default parent, the parent who maybe has the higher desire, does end up feeling really left alone. And so it can be tricky there. Isolated, exactly.
Quick break for listeners tuning in. I have a question for you. Are you a subscriber to this podcast? If this conversation is resonating with you, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. Drop a 5-star rating and leave a quick comment. It really helps other families find us and keep these conversations growing. If you want to continue the conversation, you can join us on Facebook or Instagram at Dr. Taniesha Burke. Thank you so much. Let's jump back into it. You mentioned something about transition. So you have to transition from the parenting mode to, this couple romantic mode. For parents, what tips do you have to offer? Like, how do I switch my mind from thinking about ordering things for the baby and wellness check and the whole list to let's go on a date together and just talk about stuff we used to talk about or do things we used to be interested in doing together? How do they make that transition?
Yeah, it's tricky. So this one of the things that I often like to think about is that, okay, so you think you have, your mom hat on, right? Or your parent hat on. And to take that parent hat off and then immediately kind of put on the wife, the husband, the lover, sort of this like more adult relationship can feel like a really tricky transition. And so actually building in, if you take off the mom hat or the parent hat and you put on your own hat. So I put on my Rebecca hat, or your Tanisha hat, right? Like, what is it that makes me me? And sometimes that's like, one of the ways that people might do this if they're going on a date or something is that they actually have some alone time where they get to take a shower. They get to get dressed. They get to put on, maybe if they even have any nice underwear left over, they, put on their, whatever it is that makes you feel a little bit more sexy, a little bit more like, and I don't even mean sexy, like sexy, but just like attractive. Like, not just like somebody's parent who's, yeah, like that's not a sexy thing to feel like, you got spit up all over your shirt and kids are dragging on you all the time. And, maybe you haven't showered in a couple of days or something. So figuring out how you can get to the place where and that oftentimes you need some solo time. So whether it's going on a date or whether it's trying to get to a place where you're wanting to have sex with your partner or be sexual with your partner after the kids go to bed, what can really help is to ask for that solo time to have a little bit easier of a transition.
Mm-hmm. So it could be the other parents taking care of the children, or you get grandparents involved and other extended family members to help you to just have that few minutes just to be by yourself for a little bit. That's pretty good, because I think I even remembered, with my boys when they were younger, it was always just going. Getting dressed and looking pretty was the least of my, need. I just wanted to sleep and as you said, the whole touch out thing as well. After a while, but it's to just get that, to be you for once and not be somebody's parent.
That's right.
One of the things that you mentioned in your book about, the different levels of desire, but you mentioned this important thing about the negative emotional cycle that can happen. So there's one parent who is really needing to be intimate because having sex might be a way of showing love. And then the other parent, there's a lower desire. So you might have one person pursuing, the other person withdrawing. And then that just makes the whole thing even worse. So I don't know if you can go into the 3 types of negative cycle, and maybe parents listening can say, hey, that's where we fit, what they are, and maybe how they can get out of that vicious negative cycle of pursuer, withdrawer, and so on.
Yes, absolutely. So this terminology that I use in the book comes from emotionally focused therapy, which was developed by Sue Johnson, who was, a really brilliant psychologist. And there's some really great books on it. Sue Johnson has a book out, she's got a book. And then one came out a couple of years ago. It's called Secure Love by Julie Manano, which I highly recommend if people are interested in this. She kind of goes through, and I touch on it in my book, but not as much as she goes into. So it's an attachment-focused method. So it uses the idea that our attachments, we as humans are attached. We're designed to be attached. We're wired to be attached. And so in relationships, what ends up happening is that we end up getting stuck in very predictable ways. So that's what we call the negative cycle. And you'll know the negative cycle because when you get in it, it ends up feeling like, oh my gosh, here I am again. I'm frustrated in this same way. And so a typical negative cycle is a pursue withdraw cycle. And so one other way of saying this, which I really like, is the more, the more. So the more I pursue, the more you withdraw. The more I talk, the more silent you are. So it's kind of pushing each other sort of further into our roles. And pursuers tend to want to talk about things. They tend to want to go into and initiate a conversation. Or we also have people who are sexual pursuers, and they may want to initiate sexual contact, physical contact. That may be how they really feel connected. And so in the same way that the emotional pursuer is after connection, the sexual pursuer is also after connection. But what ends up happening is the emotional pursuer, a lot of times when they approach their partner, they want emotional connection, but a lot of times it comes out as nagging, blame, criticism. It doesn't land. And so then their withdrawing partner ends up feeling like they can't get anything right. and they end up withdrawing even more. And when they withdraw more, their pursuing partner, who's really after connection, remember, feels even more alone, even more abandoned, even more unseen. And so that's that vicious cycle. And so interestingly, this can happen in and out of the bedroom. But a lot of times we have people who are sexual pursuers who are emotional withdrawers. So it's really common for a couple to have somebody who's emotionally pursuing outside of the bedroom, sexually withdrawing, feeling like, oh gosh, I just am not going to be able to show up here. I don't have this desire that my partner has. I'm letting them down. I'm disappointing them. There's something wrong with me. And that sexual pursuer, it's often common for them to be the emotional withdrawer because they don't feel competent in the emotional realm to show up for their emotional pursuing partner. And so then a lot of times we can get into this almost stalemate where couples will say, well, if we had sex more, I'd be more, emotionally open. And then the emotional pursuer is saying, well, if you were more emotionally available, if we could talk about things and be connected emotionally, then I would be more open to having sex. And they're both right, but they're just different ways of connecting. And when people get really stuck in their roles, you can also have someone who's pursuer both in and out of the bedroom. And that, that's sort of what we call like a synchronized cycle where the roles are pretty consistent across. But it can get really tricky there because both are really good ways of connecting. It just may be that different people have a harder time accessing in or out of the bedroom.
How do you get out of that though? Because the example you gave, all right, so women tend to be the emotional pursuer. Okay, I need to talk about what's going on. I need you to understand that these are my desires. And if I get more of it, then I might feel aroused and want to have sex with you. And the man might not want to feel or have the urge to want to express his feelings, but he wants to be physical. That clash, it's going to end up being where there's no sex at all, or the sex is horrible. So how do parents even begin to get out of that when one is emotionally pursuing, the other one is physically pursuing, and so on? It's like it's not in sync. How do they get out of that cycle?
It's a really good question. So one of the ways that they can get out of a cycle if they're feeling really, really stuck is by actually working with a therapist, because sometimes it can help to have a third person. If you're at the point where, it really feels so stuck and really impossible, or even just a little bit stuck, working with a therapist can really, really help. But understanding where your partner is coming from. So a lot of times what ends up happening is we end up feeling like we feel alone. We feel let down. We feel rejected. And when we feel that way, we think that our partner is doing it on purpose. We think you don't care enough. You're not invested enough. You don't find me attractive anymore. And all of that is taking our partner's stuckness personally. And then it lands personally, and we take it that way, and then we get more and more protected ourselves and less able to connect. And so that's the negative cycle. The negative cycle feeds itself. But what we want to do is we want to reverse that negative cycle and play out a new positive cycle where when I show up for you, then you show up for me. And then that positive cycle sort of feeds itself. And so the more we can do that, reverse that negative cycle and make it into a positive one, the more helpful, it can be. And that starts with understanding. It starts with understanding that, I almost have never worked with a couple outside, those really big blow up fights where, someone might not really be caring what they say. They're so angry that they may say hurtful things, not on purpose, but because they're super dysregulated. But outside of that example, I have almost never worked with a couple where there was intentional harm done. Mostly it's rupture. It's inevitable and it's mostly unintentional. But in order to repair, we have to be able to make that really intentional. Repair has to be intentional, and it has to include perspective taking. So there's no world in which we're not going to ever get stuck in a negative cycle. We're not ever going to hurt each other, because when people are really important to each other, they have more capacity to hurt each other. And so really the way out is through curiosity and understanding, really trying to understand your partner's pain, where they get stuck, where their hurts are, and understanding that they are equally as stuck in that cycle as you are. So blaming the cycle, blaming that you each got stuck in this, in different ways, but you're stuck together, and blaming that cycle is where we start with starting to reverse it.
Yeah, and to start the process of repair. So I want to know, some people might say, even from the religious perspective, that, it's your spouse, even though you don't feel like doing it, you should still have sex. It's like this obligatory kind of sex. Is that helpful at all, or does that help them to move out of that vicious cycle eventually? Like, okay, I'm not in the mood right now, but I'm still going to give my partner what they desire. And maybe over time, my desire will come back. Do you see that in your practice? And if so, is that helpful, or does that make the situation even worse?
I think that it's important to ask a few questions there, because obligation sex is not satisfying for either partner. It's obligation. The other part of that is like pity. So the partner who's getting the obligation sex is going to feel like, this is not what they want. It's not the connected experience that they're looking for, has been my experience working with couples. So if it's purely obligation sex, then yes, it shuts down desire. It makes everything worse. However, there are going to be times for someone who has more responsive desire where they may initially feel like, oh yeah, this is not what I want to do. But they're able to say to themselves, think of it like going to the gym. Like sometimes we really don't want to go to the gym, but we know that it's going to be good for us. And then at the end of it, after the gym, we're like, thank God I did that.
Yeah,
I know it feels so good. It feels so connected. So it's really important with a couple to get curious about how much pleasure they're getting out of their sexual relationship. So if they're in a situation where, maybe they don't really want to have sex, one person doesn't really want to have sex to begin with, but they are able to say to themselves, no, I know this is going to be good for me. It's going to be good for us. It's going to be pleasurable. And afterwards they feel like, oh, I'm so glad we did that. That was really great. Then it's not purely obligation. Then they are getting something out of it. And maybe then working with being really honest about, I don't really feel like having sex right now. Can you rub my back a little bit? Can we kind of kiss a little bit and see what happens? And having a little bit of freedom around that communication and that honesty. And having it be okay to not have everybody be starting with, really high desire. That can help a lot. It's sort of counterintuitively that if you can be honest about where you're at, as opposed to having to pretend, you're already connecting more than you were. So that's the situation where the sex is pleasurable and one person maybe just needs a little bit of a longer runway to get into that place. But if it's pure obligation, if the sex is not that pleasurable for one person, if they're really just doing it because they feel like they have to, or because they're trying to avoid, like they don't feel like they can say no. And I'm not talking about like a violence situation where it's not safe to say no, but in a relational situation, if your partner is going to get grumpy, resentful, angry when you say no, it's not safe to say no. Sometimes then it gets easier just to say yes and just get it over with. And then the sort of clock restarts and you're like, all right, whew, now I've got a week before they, are getting on me again.
I can see the distance just growing further and further and further. It's getting so much wider when that happens. You mentioned that perspective taking is one thing that can help couples. Are there any other tips that you would recommend to repair to help them to get out of that cycle where one might say, I need more emotional connection, more affection in order to get into the mood for sex, and you just need the physical touch. And there's that massive discrepancy. Is there anything else you recommend to repair that? I can take my partner's perspective. As a woman, I am just overwhelmed. I'm touched out. I just need alone time. And maybe understanding my partner's perspective is that he understands expressing his love and care for me from physical intimacy. I understand that. But okay, we understand, but how do we move forward with the understanding regarding repair? Because we can understand, like, okay, I get it. Sex, showing love to me is through physical touch for you. And that's not the way I show love. So I get it. But still, I need to feel the desire. Like, how do you repair that?
Yeah, that can be really tricky. I think that we have some pretty gendered cultural scripts that can come into play here. So yes, men have more testosterone, so they may end up feeling more spontaneous desire. But also, men and boys are not coached and encouraged to be competent in their emotional expression. They often, and I think that this is getting better, but often men and boys are told to sort of stuff their emotions. They're not encouraged to be vulnerable. Like, actually, vulnerability really gives a lot of men like the ick, because it feels like they're less manly. They're, they don't even know how to do it necessarily. And so the vulnerable connection through physical intimacy is a place where they are actually able to ask for connection. And a lot of times men are much more able to be emotionally vulnerable during sex or after sex. And so that they're craving that very understandably, because that's a place where they are, there's a permission structure about asking for what they want and getting connected. And with women, girls and women are not encouraged to express their sexual desire. And again, I think that this is getting better. But girls and women, there's a lot of coaching about being a good friend, taking care of others. And so they may feel really competent talking about their feelings and being in the emotional realm. But when it comes to expressing physical or sexual desire, that may be something that they feel really, it feels really hard to do. And so not only do we have maybe like a little bit of a gendered hormone situation happening here, it's enforced by what we think boys and men and girls and women should be. And so really, like, understanding that humans have the capacity to connect in a lot of different ways. And so a man who really feels like the only way that they can ask for connection is through sex, they've got some work to do. They've got some work to do to be able to be connected with their partner in a non-sexual way. And similarly, a woman who might feel really shut down, who maybe is not in her own body, who really struggles to, embody her own pleasure and ask for what she needs, she may also have a little bit of work to do there. Because being able to initiate in both realms is helpful for everybody, because then, then it gets you out of that stalemate.
Yeah.
But a lot of that is based on that being able to communicate, being able to be vulnerable, being able to work together, and acknowledge that, someone who has low desire, they're pretty stuck there. They're struggling. Most of the time, they're wanting to show up for their partner. They're wanting to show up for themselves, and they just don't know how to do it.
Okay, so for persons who are listening who are, low desire, don't know how to articulate it, high desire, don't know how to articulate it, and they need to get to that place of vulnerability, can you give like a script that they might use to kind of initiate that, okay, I'm not used to being vulnerable. This is important to me. I'm trying to start the conversation. Sometimes people might just say the wrong thing that just shuts down the other person. Is there a vulnerability script maybe that can just jumpstart the conversation so that if you looked at the gendered roles, in particular, men can feel safe to be vulnerable about their need for physical desire, and also women can say, hey, I really prefer if we do a lot of flirtation and hugs and kisses way before, instead of just touching me when you're horny, kind of thing, without making him feel crappy about himself. Like, what can they say to kind of, not have the other person become defensive? And,
Yes. That's so hard. The defensiveness can be so hard. So I think that it helps to share where you're struggling to start with. So for a low desire partner, what that might mean is, I really want to be connected with you. And I really feel so shut down. I miss being more sexual with you too. I miss what it was like. And I don't know what to do, because in our current life, I sometimes am feeling really alone. I'm sometimes feeling like really overwhelmed, and it's hard. And I want to get there too. Like, can I want to work on this together? And so sometimes it can help to ask, like, so for instance, if you're a person who notices that, at the end of the day, after putting the kids to bed, it's like the worst, putting bedtime can be so terrible that at that time you're just like, oh, I am done. I'm not like this, I can't possibly like take off the hat and get now all sexy after bedtime. Maybe you ask your partner to do bedtime on nights that you want to have sex, or maybe you clean up the kitchen together. Maybe you can ask for something that you need or you want outside the bedroom that can help you get more in to being together. Because really, for the low desire partner, it's really important to express desire to be with your partner at the same time as you're saying that you're struggling. And for higher desire partners, or for people who are more the emotional withdrawer, starting with I feel statements can be really a good place to start. And it doesn't have to be something really huge. It can just be, I feel, I listened to a podcast today and it made me feel really sad, or it made me think something. Or it can be expressing appreciation. I feel so lucky to have you as my partner. I just was thinking about you today and I felt so much gratitude and so much love for you. So being able to express a little bit, vulnerability isn't, we think of vulnerability as always being negative, like sad, mad, like, we're sort of in this hole and someone sees us there and we're, but it doesn't have to be. Vulnerability is being impacted. That's all it is. And so when someone is vulnerable, the way that we join them there is by showing that we're impacted, that we're touched by them. And similarly, when we want to show somebody that our own vulnerability, we show something real that touched us. And that could be something that made us mad, that made us feel sad, that made us feel, scared. But it also could be something that made us feel deeply joyful. We cry when we're happy and when we're sad. Being really joyful can be very vulnerable.
I am happy that you mentioned that vulnerability doesn't have to be negative, because I think a lot of us think of vulnerability as I'm struggling, I'm suffering, I'm sad, and so on. But it's really good. Like, I saw something today that reminded me of you and your smile and, how you are playful when you're happy and that kind of thing. I think that's a really good thing for couples to hear, that it doesn't have to be a negative emotion, but something of an appreciation and recognition of the other partner. And I'm happy you mentioned it, to keep it in the I statement, because once you go to You make me feel you don't touch me anymore. Every time I want to have sex, I have to beg you, beg you. There's nobody who's going to be aroused by any of that. And they're more likely to run away and find the excuse, I have a headache, I'm tired, and all of that. So it's to keep it in the I statement. I desire you. I miss hugging you. I miss cuddling you. I miss the way we used to stare at each other when we make love and that kind of thing. Yeah. So, that you keep it there so the other person can then be more receptive and vulnerable to your statements. Can you explain how our nervous system affects our desire to be intimate with our partners? We have the fight, flight, freeze, fawn kind of thing going on, but you also have when we're in a state of calm and relaxation. Maybe we start with the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, how that negatively impact our intimacy, and then maybe we can tie in the other part where we're very calm and relaxed and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, I think a lot of people will be familiar with the fight and flight responses when we get, really triggered. Freeze and fawn are a little bit less known. So freeze is like, if you imagine like almost like a bunny rabbit, they do this a lot where they freeze, but their body is like vibrating with energy. So it's a frozen state, but not a shutdown. It's a frozen state that can explode into action at any point. And then fawn is also a state where we can, it's a safety state. A lot of times you might see this like, I like using like the animal kingdom because we have often seen this in our animals. So like a lot of times when you see a dog who's more submissive, they roll over and they're like licking the dog and they're trying to please the more dominant dog. So that's like sort of a fawn state. And the fawn state can really be a pretty like a trauma state. So a lot of people who have, been survivors of, some sort of trauma or abuse will have this response of it keeps them safe to make somebody else happy. And so those states, we do not have access to like emotional regulation. We don't have access to long-term planning. We're not, our prefrontal cortex is totally offline. And so we're really dysregulated when we're in these states. This is not a sexual state. Digestion shuts down, sexual function is not, really possible in this state. And so, that it is a state. It's not bad to get into these. We all need to, when we say regulate our nervous systems, what that means is having a flexible nervous system that can move through different states. These fight, flight, freeze, fawn states, they keep us safe. And so when we feel threatened, we go to these states. And, most of us in our modern lives, we're not physically threatened as much as we might have been when our bodies developed these states, like back in the, Neanderthal times when there's like a saber-toothed tiger coming at us. But our bodies still react the same way. We still get that shot of adrenaline. And so we can look at a, social media post and have this response. We can look at our partner in the kitchen and they look sort of like grumpy and we say, oh shit, what happened? Like things aren't okay between us. That can put us.
Or maybe they respond to us with a little sharp
totally
response, not necessarily have anything to do with you, but they just have a rotten day with getting an email from their boss or something, and they're very short and stern, and you think it's, oh my God, what did I do? Right?
That's exactly right. So all of those things can put us into a threat state, which is why sometimes we get really defensive, we get really reactive. So we get a sharp tone from our partner, and all of a sudden we are not having access to the part of us that says, oh, maybe they had a rough day. Maybe I should get curious. Are you okay? Like, wow, you seem like you're having a tough time. Are you okay? We're like, what is your problem? We get all defensive or we shut down. Yeah, don't speak to me like that. Or we totally shut down. We just walk out. We don't say anything. So in those flight or fight, we do not have the capacity to connect. So that's a big player in that negative cycle that we talked about earlier. And then there's another state, which is a shutdown state. In polyvagal theory, it's called the dorsal vagal shutdown. And basically what that means, it can be something like a dissociative state. You know, if you have someone who's like experienced a pretty significant trauma, they can dissociate and they're sort of like physically there, but not. And that's a protective state. However, in our modern lives, we often are in sort of a shut down state on the regular, really. Like, so an example of this that could happen like in a completely normal situation, not like a trauma situation, would be, you know, doom scrolling at the end of the day. I think we're all familiar with that, where we're like, I just want to shut off. And then you're like on your phone and you're scrolling through Instagram or, you know, TikTok or whatever. And it's like an hour can go by and it's just a black hole where you really are not really able to connect. So I think that that's where a lot of us find ourselves at the end of each day, because our nervous systems are running on a really high clip. And then eventually we just kind of collapse. And that's also not a state where we're able to really connect with each other. But then there's a third state, which is the parasympathetic, which is the safe, connected, sort of that, you know, you have more of those like laughing, connecting, safe, social kind of situation. And that is going to be much more. We need to have at least a little bit of that on board where, you know, maybe you're able to laugh. Sometimes this can happen, you know, after you've gone and moved your body. If you're in a state where, you know, you're really stressed and then you go to the gym or you go for a walk and you come back and you're like, oh, okay, I feel better. I'm ready to talk to somebody now. And so that is sort of the state where we're much more likely to want to be connected or want to pursue connection if we can get to that state where we've sort of re-regulated ourselves.
And for the nervous system, you know, when they're in fight, flight, freeze, fawn, do you have any recommendation for parents, like how everyday tips that they can, when they recognize they're in one of those phases, that they can quickly use to kind of get themselves back into homeostasis instead of doom scrolling every single night? So if they notice they're doom scrolling every night after the children are in bed and they can't connect with each other, what everyday tips can they start implementing in their daily activity to help keep them grounded so that that connection is possible?
So the first thing that you need to do is you need to bring some intention and attention to what your actual nervous system state is, because so many of us get used to being in either this like really high fight flight state and we don't realize that that's where we are. And so, you know, sometimes we are in that state and we just have to power through. And we just have to do the best we can. But when you find yourself in that fight, flight, freeze, fawn state, taking a break is really what we need. And often that means, sometimes it means taking a break, getting a hug, co-regulating in some ways. You know, I think we see this with our children a lot, is that many of our children may co-regulate much faster. You know, if a baby is crying and they're like really in this high arousal state and you hold them and you, shh, it's okay. You know, they're able to regulate themselves a lot more. Sometimes people need alone time. You know, I have one of my kids in particular regulates a lot more quickly when he is able to have some alone time. A lot of times the dog is in with him. So actually that's a really good tip, is if you have a pet, particularly a mammal, petting, spending a little bit of time with your animal can be a really good way to co-regulate if you don't have a safe human who you can just kind of like collapse into next to you. And, you know, another thing that can be really helpful, whether you're in a shutdown state or whether you're in sort of that high arousal fight or flight, is hot or cold water. So hot water tends to be very relaxing. I say water because that's the thing that's like the most accessible to us a lot of times. So like a hot shower or hot bath, we know, a lot of us know, like that can really take the nervous system down. And so if you find yourself in like a really high arousal state and you were to like, you know, maybe move your body, like you say, you know, do some movement and then take a shower, by the end of that, likely you're going to be much more calm. Similarly, a splash of cold water, you know, that old thing that like grandma used to say where it's like, go splash some water on your face, get yourself together. It's like, well, actually that really works. It really does. Like splashing a little bit of cold water on your face does actually, especially if you're in that dorsal vagal shutdown, it can like wake you right up, you know? And so I think that, you know, those sort of tips really like moving the body, thinking about how you get that adrenaline moving through. And I'm not talking about, you know, don't have to like go for a run or go and work out really hard at the gym, although that does work for some people. But even just like doing a little bit of gentle stretching or going for a walk or dancing, shaking your body, humming or singing is also like really effective to help you move through that state.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing you, when, as you were speaking, I'm thinking, a lot of parents might say, you know, I have so many children, I don't have time for that. Maybe it's to really look that maybe we need to, as a family, sit down and provide some serious structure. I mean, initially, if you have children who are like 4 or 5 and above who can start to be independent, initially they might resist, but it sounds as if there has to be some kind of structure, not random times children are going to bed instead of 8 o'clock every night, so that maybe there's a 3-4 window, you know, available for you as a couple and as an individual to kind of recoup that. There has to be some kind of boundary to say, this is what we're going to do at X time. And also for you to even have a few minutes, even if it's in the bathroom, to kind of regroup yourself. So for parents who are saying, I don't have the time, maybe having a family meeting to say, hey, who needs to take over more responsibility of X, Y, and Z regarding chores and so on. I've been bad with putting you to bed at random times. We need to have more structure and so on to kind of help to provide the tiny window available for both parents to kind of breathe and relax so that the connection can come about. I want to ask you about some scenarios as we're closing, and how the parents can get over that, because I think some parents might say, yes, but my circumstance is a bit different. So you talked about how there are couples who might have gone through fertility treatment, and so their form of physical contact, sex, was just really, okay, this is ovulation time, my body temperature is X, it's time to get going. How do they move away from, okay, the baby's born, we need to get back to being intimate, but maybe we've spent 12 months, 24 months just on the clock trying to get pregnant. How do we then find that romance and connection after going through that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Fertility and infertility can be such, like, it's one of the things that really tanks the pleasurable sex life pretty quickly. I think that for that couple and for all couples who are struggling here with like a high or low desire, really expanding the definition of what sex is. Because a lot of times a committed couple, they end up being, you know, a little bit routine about how they have sex. They have certain things that they do together that work pretty well. A lot of times they're really pleasurable. There's nothing wrong with that. But what ends up happening over time is when someone initiates sex, it's very clear exactly what they're initiating. And that takes all of the exploration out of it. And this really happens with couples who have struggled with infertility, because they are actually needing to have penis and vagina reproductive sex in order to conceive. But for people who are not trying to conceive, that is not, they don't need to have that kind of sex every single time. They can really expand the definition of what sex means to them. And with the couples that I work with, I ask them to actually, we work to expand the definition even to the point that talking about sex is sex. Because couples who have really good and sustained sex lives, they talk about sex more than they have sex. And talking about sex does not necessarily mean to need to mean like sharing fantasies. It can be talking about, you know, how you can, the example of like how I could be more available. Like if you put the kids to bed, that's talking about sex. Looking at your schedules and saying, when are we going to be able to get together this week? When can we carve out a little bit of time? The conversation of like, I know we had a goal that we were going to try to have sex tonight, but I am so tired. Could I see you in the morning? What does your noon time look like tomorrow? Maybe tomorrow night. Like even that is talking about sex. So that all counts as being sexual together.
Yeah. Okay. And what about, there's so many women who struggle with getting back into that arousal phase after they've had a traumatic birth.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could have been that they planned this beautiful birthing process, and in the middle of it, everything just goes haywire, C-section, all kind of things go wrong. And now they're home. Maybe the baby's a little bit older, but still that experience is still trapped in their body. And the husband probably wonders what's going on. You're healing. Everything is fine. How does a couple reconnect after such a traumatic thing that the husband obviously or spouse didn't have any part of? It's just a medical thing that happened. How can they reconnect with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So I would say that if there's like really sort of that traumatic experience, it can be really helpful to get some professional help because trauma is trauma and it can definitely put you into a nervous system state that is hard to navigate. And there can be PTSD and everything from a traumatic birth. So definitely if that's, a situation that a listener is in, getting some professional help can be really helpful. It also... Yeah.
Sorry, I was about to ask too, and what do you say to the partner witnessing that? How can they be supportive of their partner as they work through that trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, just recognizing that it's trauma. And actually for the spouse, for the partner who's watched it, it can also be deeply traumatic as well. And that partner may have feelings of like not wanting to hurt their spouse, not wanting to, that they may actually be struggling to want to be sexual as well. That's also very common. So that can be something that they can work through together. They can work through individually. Talking about it can really help, and being honest about where they're getting stuck and, joining together and trying to be supportive of each other can be a really powerful place to start there.
Yeah. This one might be a bit of a loaded one, but what if there was an affair in the relationship and the couple have decided, okay, we're not going to pull apart. We're going to try to work it through. But the partner who was cheated on find it so hard to reconnect physically, sexually. And the partner who cheated obviously feels guilty and wanting to reconnect and trying to reconnect. But the person who was hurt is still pulling away emotionally. How can couples, I know this is probably a whole different podcast, based on the thing, but just what can the person who was cheated on do as a simple thing, not necessarily the whole solution, and the person who cheated, what they need to be mindful of?
Yeah. So sex after an affair can be really challenging. And so a lot of times I see couples who come in and they're actually having a ton of sex after the affair if they've decided to stay together, because there is a little bit of like a trauma response there, reconnecting. It feels very intense. And so, but once that kind of calms down, it can be really tricky to get back to like a normal, safe sexual relationship. It's also equally common for the sex to just like not be happening at all. So the person who cheated, they need to be aware that there is a trauma. Being cheated on, trauma is too much too soon. And so when you're just like going around and you think everything's fine, and then all of a sudden it turns out something is happening that you did not know, and you find out, that creates a trauma. So the betrayed partner may have that come up for them in a really intense way, repeatedly over the course of months or even years. And so that person who cheated needs to just be aware that that is going to continue to happen. This is not something that people are going to get over quickly, and they need to just be able to be there and be supportive and be understanding, even if it feels like it's taking a really long time. And the person who's the betrayed partner, a lot of times what they end up doing is they end up looking for a lot of information. So they want to know, what did you do? Where did you do it? How did you do it? What did you feel about it? Did you love them? Did you like it better than with me? All of these questions. And they might go down the rabbit hole on the internet of like researching this partner and everything.
Yeah.
That is re-traumatizing. So yes, we want to be able to have the person who betrayed answer questions extremely truthfully. You have to be as truthful as possible. And also, the betrayed partner needs to restrain themselves because if they have too much information, it's re-traumatizing. They can't unsee it. But honestly, if there's been an affair and, if it's at all possible to get professional help, really having someone to guide you through that, and work through the entire cycle. Because a lot of times people get to this sort of like status quo where there's like been a repair sort of, and then they just kind of move forward, but they never quite get back together. So professional help there can be really helpful.
I think the majority of our conversations, we're focusing on the couple with younger children. So for those who might have children in middle childhood and teenage years, and these children are now more independent, you don't have to be there to cook a meal for them every day, put them to bed. You don't have to have that really manager hat on. You're more coaching and guiding. So there's more time for the couple who is parenting children in the middle childhood and adolescent phase, and they realize, oh my God, we've just been managers and we're really roommates. Our children are not really needing us anymore. So how do we reignite that romance after a long stretch? Because at least for the people with children under 5, it's a short window, right? So there might be enough time to repair. But what happens if that disconnect is like 10, 15 years long? Mm-hmm. Where do they start?
Yeah, that can definitely be challenging, and it happens, So I think that if you are in a relationship where talking about sex feels comfortable, and you can talk about your desire, you can talk about wanting to get back together, how you make time, but your sex life has just kind of like, sort of fizzled, but your degree of comfort talking about it is pretty high. Mm-hmm. Then you can communicate openly and, sort of find your way through that way. But a lot of times what ends up happening is that people actually stop talking about it as well. So it can feel really uncomfortable. So if that's the state that you're in and you're in like a very low sex or no sex marriage and you're trying to reconnect, sometimes, again, not to sound like a broken record, but getting the help of a professional can be really helpful. However, if that's, where a good place to start would be to start outside the bedroom. So reconnecting in terms of like finding, shared interests, or, maybe you always wanted to learn how to like swing dance or something, like go take a swing dancing class together, or, carving out some time to remember not only do you love each other and you're committed to each other, but actually that you like each other. So what was it that you did that made you feel like you liked each other? And that liking of each other, where that feeling of like, oh, I like you so much, that's where that like flirting, the erotic energy can start. And so really that can be a sort of like intimidating place to start, is to reconnect outside the bedroom. And it's not a direct line. You can be very deeply reconnected outside the bedroom and have like a really strong friendship and not necessarily have a sexual connection. But a lot of times it does kind of lead you back.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess this is the same tip you would give for the empty nesters, right? Or is there?
Yes.
So yeah, is there anything else? Or that's the tip you would give for empty nesters. Because I have seen situations where the children are now grown, they've gone off to university, and the couple is now like looking at each other. Now, mm-hmm. What? We've just been parenting for the past 18, 20, 22 years. And now we're left with no longer managing little people. how do we as a couple find our way back as a couple? Because a lot of marriages also end after the children have left the home.
Yeah. A lot of times the marriages that end after the children have left the home have been ones where there's been a lot of neglect over a period of time of the relationship. Most relationships don't break up because there's so much conflict. They break up because there's neglect of the bond. And so, to the extent to which it's possible, none of us can create more time. We don't have magic wands. We can't make more hours in the day. So then it leaves us needing to protect the time that we have. And I really appreciated what you said about creating those routines and protecting that, not just for the kids, but for the parents. So really making the time together something that is a priority, even when it's hard, in the same way that we make it a priority getting our kids to school on time and making that to their soccer practices or making sure that their naps or their feeding schedule. So protecting it with that same kind of vigor, but empty nest, absolutely. Figuring out what you like to do together, rediscovering that. And a lot of times this also happens in the bedroom because around this time where kids go to college, where, we have aging bodies as well. So we've got menopause, perimenopause on board. Maybe erections are a little bit less predictable than they used to be. And so the way that a couple was having sex in their 20s is not going to be the way that they have sex in their 60s. Like it just isn't. And so being creative, continuing to communicate, continuing to expand the definition of what sex is and how we can share sexuality and be connected in that way. It doesn't only have to be one way. And so couples who have, long-term sex life where they're connected over the course of a long marriage are couples who are flexible and couples who are curious, and they stay that way.
Yeah. As you mentioned, the perimenopause, menopause, I think that is so important to be also mindful of, and why the vulnerability and the communication is so important too, because I think a lot of women, once they hit their 40s, they're going through so many hormonal changes and they might not be clearly communicating that to their spouse. And the spouse is also wondering, you have changed so much in not so much of a desirable way. What's going on? And to have that vulnerability, and maybe is it good to learn together what the changes of perimenopause look like, menopause is like, so that the other partner can also have compassion and patience, and so that they can better support the woman who is going through those stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's a lot of really good resources now. I think that this has really changed within the last 5 to 10 years. And so, really there are a lot of good resources. There's a lot of good, and there's a lot of good medication like hormone replacement therapy. There's been some really good studies that have shown that it is really safe for most people. And so if you're somebody who's struggling going through perimenopause, there are some really good resources out there, not only medically, but also in terms of, there's been some really good books that have come out recently. This is a place that's gotten a lot of attention, and I think really needed attention. And women who are in perimenopause or in menopause, it doesn't need to be the end of your sex life. Many, many women who are in menopause actually find that they feel much more free, much more sexually open with their partner. They're not worried about conceiving an unwanted child. They're not worried about like their period coming, or, there can be a lot of freedom in this phase of life. And I know many women who are having the best sex of their life in menopause. I also know many women who, maybe are struggling with painful intercourse. And so they're needing to, have medications on board, lubrication, and also communication with their partner to see how they can continue to have pleasurable sex even into menopause.
Yeah, this conversation, I'm hearing intentionality, communication, vulnerability to kind of keep you together as a couple. It's to have that open dialogue on an ongoing basis, and to be intentional with connecting outside of the bedroom not just, okay, one person is ready, but it's the constant flirtation or the gentle hugs and the kisses and text messages. Maybe, how are you doing? Missing you today. Saw this thing that reminded me of you, and spontaneous gifts and so on. All of those kind of help to bring the connection back and to maintain the connection. To close the conversation, can you give parents one more tip, or do you have something you want to reiterate to parents about what they can do to maintain that part of their relationship to make it healthy, strong, vibrant, even in the midst of managing a whole household?
Absolutely. So focus on the micro moments. So a micro moment might be something like, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned how like the hellos and goodbyes, they can fall off. The mornings and the evenings are so hectic and crazy. And so then our partner comes in and we're like, oh, hey, or maybe they don't even get that. Maybe we're looking at our phone or looking at our kids and it's like, where have you been? This has been crazy around here, So making sure that you're focusing on the micro moments, and people can literally do this right now. Like pause the podcast, text your partner, tell them how much you appreciate them. When they come in, or when, going over and having an actual hug. Hi, I'm so happy to see you. You're home. A goodbye, actually putting something down, taking a moment, like literally 5 seconds, where you go over and you look at them and you say, there you are, my beloved. I remember you. Do you remember me? Here we are in this crazy life together. Or, taking the dog for a walk and holding hands. Like just these little moments. You give a hug and take a deep breath. Pass them in the kitchen and put your hand along their back. Like these little micro moments keep the climate of the relationship warm. And that helps the entire ecosystem of the family. And it makes all of the communication so much easier, so much more open, less defensive. So
Yeah.
I think that is something that every couple can do right now.
Micro moments. Cherish the micro moments.
Exactly.
Now, for couples who want to work with you, they might realize, oh God, even if after I've gone through the book, we're still struggling together. How can they reach out to you to work with you? And for those who might, be able to make the shift on their own, but they want to remain connected, share your social media where they can follow your content and your advice.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website's a good resource. It has all of the stuff about me. It's just my name, RebeccaEudy.com. And then my social media is also my name, Rebecca Howard Eudy on Instagram. I have a newsletter. If people go to my website and they sign up for my newsletter, you'll get like a little excerpt. I think it's like the intro and the first chapter of the book. The book you can find any place books are sold, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all of those big book retailers. And then if people want to work with me, so as a therapist, I work with people in the states that I'm licensed in. So the state of Massachusetts and the state of Connecticut in the United States. But I also do coaching with couples. And so that's a little bit of a different, it's not so much of a clinical focus. It's more goal focused. But if people are wanting to connect emotionally or sexually, they can work with me as a coach. And that can also be done through my website as well.
Thank you so much. And we do hope all the parents who listen to this podcast, who might see that our sex life is kind of not going too great, that they implement the tips that you provided, especially the micro moments of the relationship, and see the sparks return to the relationship. Thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me.